I would, briefly introduce Pari so that in case there are members of the audience who aren't very well acquainted with our work, they'd get to know why it is that we are on this panel to amplify voices. The People's Archive of Rural India is a digital archive. We're a contemporary journal, as you said. And as the name suggests, Pari covers issues out of rural India, where 833 million Indians live as per the census of 2011. And if numbers are anything to go by, then I suppose these 833 million make up the mainstream of your population. But the mainstream media grossly underrepresents what is happening in rural India. So Pari exists to fill that information gap. It's not just a geographic coverage, though. It's not that we only focus on issues in rural India. I think the larger mandate that governs our journalism is covering inequality. And how we do this is through simple storytelling, right? Where the person who is being interviewed is the driver of the story. So you'll see that when you read our stories or if you watch our videos, there's very little editorializing from the reporter. A person like me whose socio-cultural, economic context is very different from a person I am reporting about in, say, a hamlet in some remote part of India. So when we do not editorialize a lot, when we give people this space and this platform to, talk about their lives, you're giving them a space to be heard, right? And that is how you try to bridge this gap or this huge chasm of information that is absent in our media. It's not complex. It's not like often through a lot of heavy empirical data, but through very simple and powerful storytelling. If I may cite an example, there's a story on the website that's called Biswas and the Bamboos. It's essentially driven by 4 powerful pictures. It's of this man who is on a lonely road, a lonely highway in Tripura. And he has on his rickety cycle that he's pushing 4 bamboos. Bamboos are extremely deceptive. It's a deceptive tree because you think that it's light. But these 4 bamboos in total weigh about 250 kgs. And this man is pushing this over a stretch of 17 kilometers. Now, when he's doing so, he doesn't have the luxury of a break, because if he does take a break, who's going to help him pick up this cycle, right? So this is something he has to do. He cannot cut the bamboo. He cannot put it in a truck. He cannot opt for alternative means of transportation because bamboos are required to be of a certain length. I'm sure this is something we've passed as, urban Indians several times. You see people with a huge load on their back and you think that this is just a part of India's landscape. You see people riding bullock carts on bicycles. There's nothing much to be made of. But if you stop and if you were to ask somebody like Biswas about his life, he's going to tell you that this is one of 3 jobs that he does in order to make ends meet, right? And that is very telling of how a majority of India lives. Back-breaking work for very little money in order to see that you can make ends meet. So these are the kind of stories that are on Pari. Simple, powerful, effective storytelling that is a good representation of the inequality that exists in our society. Most of the hamlets that we visit are places that have never really seen a news camera. And I don't want to play a blame game here because the news today is about the revenue models are really complicated, and how they get their money and where they get their money from is really a subject for a whole other debate. But you will see that coverage is very stilted towards urban cities, etc. So where is the chance, where is the scope of going to remote parts of this country and really finding out what's going on there? Another thing I want to mention is that Pari is not a news platform. You're unlikely to go onto the website and see breaking news. What you will see are stories like Biswas or of farmers or of migrants that explain the news. So we cover processes. We don't break news. Our stories are reflective of why you have so much going wrong in the news, be it in terms of farmer suicides, be it in terms of the migrant crisis that exploded, once the COVID-19 lockdown hit this country. And I think, I'll say more over the course of this debate, but perhaps to give you a more pertinent statistic as to why Pari exists is a little study that was conducted in 2015 by a media watchdog called the Center for Media Studies in Delhi. And it was found out that your mainstream national dailies, your big newspapers that are published out of more than one city, so out of more than New Delhi, perhaps in another metro, their front page dedicates about 67% of its space to what is happening in New Delhi. No doubt what happens in New Delhi has a trickle-down effect. It affects the whole of this country. But to say that that much goes into explaining what goes on in the capital with very little attention given to the rest of this country, it reflects a horrible problem with the media. So while 67% goes to New Delhi, it was found out that over the course of 5 years, on average, less than 1% of that front page landscape goes to rural India. And Pari exists to sort of bridge that gap. Even if it's not going to happen in your mainstream papers, we hope that our small but growing digital platform is able to make audiences more aware of rural realities. So I think I'll end there.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you, Vishaka. I think
Sure.
what ought to be done by the mainstream media, that is what something done by, I don't want to call it as alternative media, because again, that demeans the work which we are doing. Yeah, thanks for bringing out such stories which are which really matter, which are non-urban, non-metro. Over to our second person, Dr. Anjali Monterio. Would you like to go ahead?
Sure.
Yeah.
I thought what I do is maybe sort of look at the terms of the debate that we're talking about. First of all, I must confess I have some discomfort with the term media literacy, because it tends to kind of reek of some kind of hierarchies of knowledge, that there are some people who are literate and there are some people who are not literate. Since I think to be human is to express oneself, one should everybody and to express oneself is to use media. I think everybody is literate and non-literate. For instance, I would consider myself, non-literate in many media spheres, whether it is, the profound and abstract art of indigenous communities, or the subversive ways in which young people are using new technologies to escape surveillance of, state and market in these times. So I think we have to talk about media literacies in the plural, and look at different kinds of media, not just the electronic media, because the kinds of media that are being used by a lot of citizens in this country are not necessarily these media alone. Secondly, of course, even media literacy as far as electronic media production is concerned, need not be tied up with literacy in terms of reading and writing. And I think the DDS, Dalit Women's Collective has shown that, and their wonderful work, is one of the examples of this, where, non-literate women are, really speaking, saying their piece in very interesting ways. Now, to come to the idea of, democracy, democratic responsibilities and citizenship, I think today, given the times, at least in this country, speaking truth to power, to the increasingly concentrated autocratic and exclusionary power of both, the corporations and the state, is something that becomes, I think, a prime responsibility of all citizens. And it's a tricky minefield to be negotiated, because, as we know, the media are controlled by and large by them, including the media that seem to be accessible to people. And I think, asking the question today in India, who are citizens, is very important, because we need to understand how millions of citizens are being potentially disenfranchised through the passing of exclusionary laws, through a very unjust law and order machinery, and through the politics of hate. So the question of citizenship, we need to kind of really engage with critically. If one looks at the power of visual storytelling, I think we also need to understand that it can cut in various ways. I mean, if today we see the way in which, at the grassroots level, a certain kind of majoritarian politics is being played out, and where WhatsApp is being used, in very vicious ways, WhatsApp and other social media in very vicious ways to spread prejudice about communities, to troll opposition, to spread hate. So I think in this context also, critical media education becomes extremely important. And, where one looks at this critical media education as a space where one can both look at the media critically and also confront one's own prejudices about various things. And I think this should be something that's an integral part of school and college education, which unfortunately it is not in most places. Today we see that definitely, spaces have grown in terms of access to the media and the means of production. There is, at one level, a democratization that has taken place there. But at another level, spaces are also shrinking if one looks at the way in which media are being controlled. You know, whether it is the shutting down of internet in Kashmir or other so-called disturbed areas, or the way in which media conglomerates are monitoring every click of ours in order to sell us things. I mean, we see that democratic spaces are shrinking in various ways. In fact, there's an interesting joke I remember which a journalist colleague from another neighboring country told us, and he said that there was this leader who was, holding forth to a group of journalists, and he's saying, "Oh, we have freedom of expression in our country." And one journalist got up and said, "But sir, what about freedom after expression?" So this is the kind of, situation we face in our country today, where, even the Supreme Court is, really, we see is not really, dedicated to freedom of expression. Lastly, I'd like to say that, communities and people are not an undifferentiated, innocent substratum. And they are shot through with all kinds of relationships of power and resistance. So when we talk about people, when we talk about communities, I think it's very important to understand who gets included and who gets excluded. And, a lot of the times, Dalits, queer people, disabled people, all kinds of, women, all kinds of other kind of marginal citizens tend to get excluded, and there are people speaking on behalf of them rather than them speaking for themselves. Of course, there are many, many signs of hope, and Vishaka just shared the work of Pari, and there's so many other spaces, whether it's Dalit Camera or the DDS people all over the country, or even young people, using media in so many different subversive ways. So I think we need to look to these signs of hope. We need to strengthen these signs of hope, and we need to participate, in these kinds of processes of using media to put across democratic voices in a situation which is quite fraught and difficult. So I think I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts on how larger saffronization has created a wide gap between those who identify with one color or the sacred cow, which has permeated to our own lives as well. You're talking about something which is a gap created because of religion. And Vishaka was speaking about a gap created because of privilege, access, all that. Welcome, Sudipto. I've seen you right from 2006, working with Baba Budangiri issue to Dalit issues to all that. So in terms of politics of exclusion, how mainstream media chooses something not to speak about, or what we ought to respond through other media which we choose, who claim as activists or journalists with the right heart. So would you speak from that perspective?
Okay. See, because you followed my work, we've talked often in the past about the fact that every reporter brings a certain gaze into a subject, and I believe I come from the anti-caste tradition, and therefore my gaze is tuned in that way. And when you talk about inclusion, when you talk about different perspectives getting included in the media narrative, from my standpoint, I don't see any real heroes, because as you would, a lot of people would have you believe right now that there is this finite bad and there's this infinite good which we need to tap into. That finite bad is the government in power right now, and that infinite good is represented by the so-called secular, liberal, cosmopolitan, whatever. For me, they are two sides of the same coin, because public spaces, public discourse in India is shaped by upper caste, entitled, forward caste people, irrespective of gender, irrespective of religion. When you see Christians who are setting the agenda, it is upper caste Christians. When you talk about when you look for somebody to set the agenda for another minority, Muslims, you will always find Sayyid Ashrafs. When you talk about feminism, for example, right? You're talking about Brahmin women. When you're talking about queer politics, you're talking about, again, one bunch of people who are very vocal, know English, have global connectivity. And as a result of that, their voices are heard. And unfortunately, this hegemony of the upper caste in every sphere of public discourse has given the impression that this opinion that they represent is the entire non-Sanghi spectrum. And for me as a journalist, that is my frustration, right? What does it translate into, this upper caste gaze, right? In Bangalore, we call it Maida gaze, right? Maida is a kind of thing which does not have any texture, it has no nutrition, it just is amorphous, but it exists everywhere, right? For us, that is how we see upper caste hegemony, right? How does this translate? How does this translate into reportage? What happens is, to give you just 2 or 3 examples, so there is this term that I use often, saying Maida. Okay, everyone says upper caste and all that, but Professor Kancha Ayalaya, for example, many other anti-caste scholars have just used a simple word, which is the Hindu state of mind. And this Hindu state of mind is shared by a cosmopolitan cross-section cutting across even religion, right? The Goan Catholics, for example, are very, very Hindutva in the same way as Savarkar would have imagined them as Hindutva. Everyone should read. Today we are talking about Hindutva, everyone should read Savarkar and look at the communities which he listed as allies of Hindutva. So how does this translate? This translates, to my frustration, into anti-Hindutva posturing. Whereas for me, the problem is Hinduism. It translates into posturing against AFSPA, because AFSPA is bad. One cop is bad. It doesn't translate into accommodating the actual aspiration of people either in Manipur or people in Kashmir, right? Because of the Hindu state of mind. Okay, even the most radical left person in India, if you ask them about Kashmir, right, they will say, yeah, but it's an Islamist movement, it's an Islamist aspiration for a different nation, right? And my response to that is, man, Jyoti Basu goes to Durga Puja every year until he was alive, and all the Kerala leaders do their Onam at home. Many of them are vegetarian also. Now they pretend to be vegan and because of animal rights, but this is the contradiction of the Indian left progressive thing. And for me, the frustration is that it translates into superficial positions, it translates into dishonest positions, it translates into discourses that are convenient, right? Like that Kanhaiya Kumar fellow, right? When he comes and steals a slogan from a bunch of people who have shed their blood for that slogan and says, not from India, but in India. Yeah, for you in Bihar, right? Does it apply to the person in Nagaland? Does it apply to the person in Manipur? Does it apply to the person in Kashmir? This is the Hindu state of mind, which has resulted in Hindutva. Hindutva, in fact, this state of mind, in fact, is exactly how Savarkar described the Hindu state of mind, which is that they could be secular also, they could be communal also, they could be progressive also, they could be radical also, they could be Maoist also. But cutting across the board, these are people who have shaped the discourse, which is why for me, the left wing and the right wing are just 2 wings of the same bird. I will leave that with prospective comments, and maybe you can start.
Thank you, Sudipto. I mean, probably 5 minutes is a crime to speak about all those issues you mentioned. Probably you need a lot of time, but we are aware that we are in the times where the murder of Gandhi is also protagonist on screen. That's the period we are living with, and it justifies why I killed someone, which bypasses constitution.
One Hindu killed another Hindu. One Hindutva person killed another Hindutva person for me.
Yeah.
Because Gandhi is to me the progenitor of the Hindu mind.
Yeah.
Right. So one extremist killed another extremist.
Okay. Yeah. Again, that calls for a different debate altogether. Let's have Kasun from Australia.
Look, that's a very difficult performance to back up after Sudeepo's very excellent kind of talk. I was kind of I drifted into it, so I need to come back to what I was going to say. For me, I think it goes back to something that you started, Dr. Santharaj, when you first mentioned this about that space between subjective and objective. And I always talk about this when I talk about democracy and amplifying voice, because we as journalists always use this cliche of giving voice to the voiceless, and we very rarely kind of, I think achieve that. But that's because of a number of reasons. So I'll talk about this in a kind of a theoretical idea in one sense, and a project that I'm doing at another. So to start with, for me, democracy is fine, but I even go further. I think it's a fundamental human right for people. So we talk about the freedom of expression as a fundamental human right when we talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. But we rarely talk about the right to receive information. So I'm as someone who has made a living out of being a journalist, making content, talking about stuff, and delivering that information. I think there's a huge role for us to play. So my work has always been not necessarily in the media space in particular, but more focused in journalism. So I make a very significant distinction in these two, simply because my reality is I straddle between two places, two fields, to use a Bourdieuian concept. I'm a journalist on the one hand, where I deal with facts and verification and a pragmatic or practical objectivity. So I'll come back to that idea in a moment. And on the other, I'm a communication theorist that deals with the subjectivity, the difficulty of the truth, the power structures, and so on. So it's, for me, it's about it's important to theorize and understand the complexities of this space in an abstract theoretical sense. But what is more important at the end of the day, as journalists, as communicators, is to deliver this knowledge in a more practical way. So and we'll come back to that in a longer, when we start doing the questions. So just in passing, so for me, it's not about absolute objectivities or absolute subjectivity. So it's not a Kantian objectivity, which is impossible in many ways, but it doesn't mean that we throw everything and it's subjective. It's what I think it is. I think there are truths, there are practical truths, there are pragmatic truths. And so I work in a pragmatic, practical field. And I think that's important. So I come back to Sudip's kind of argument about, we're talking about the Dalits, we're talking about the structural structures within Indian society. I live in Brisbane, where we are currently, in lockdown, but we're covering I'm partly covering an interesting story with a bunch of refugee asylum seekers. Now, these people fall outside of the spectrum of, Australian society, because they're not Australian citizens. They're not here on a valid visa. So it's very easy to kind of silence them. So what's happened over the last 3 months is there's a number of detention centres in Australia where we've essentially put these people. And the information that is coming out, and there's a lot of goodwill that's even with the journalists, but there is a lack of understanding. There's a lack of basic sort of understanding of both the issue on the one hand and the politics of it on the other. And I think these are the places that we need to bridge the gaps when we talk about, as educators, as commentators, when we start dealing with this, especially considering that we're talking to a university audience in particular. What we need to deal with is how we actually operationalize these things. How do journalists logically look at these issues and report them? So for example, whatever we say, whatever a very small number of journalists say, constantly the narrative is that these people are illegal migrants. They're not illegal migrants, they're asylum seekers. There's a significant difference. Australia is a signatory to the convention, so they've come here, legally in that sense. They've come through irregular channels because they've come on a boat, but that doesn't mean that their arrival is illegal, because if they were illegal, then we can charge them under our penal code. There's no law to charge them under. So there's very fundamental errors in our understanding of this. It's easy to push them to a side simply because they're illegals. So if they're illegals and if they're not citizens, they don't deserve our justice. So it's very easy to silence them. So so there's a significant kind of conversation going on in this space, and you know, as I'm watching this, you know, different media groups come in and do their stand-up pieces to camera and go through those tropes of conflict and you know and so on. You can almost see that story write itself just before they come in. There's nothing new. There's nothing important. There's nothing engaging. So if we are to actually deliver this, so again I go back to this idea as journalists, not so much necessarily as a media maker. If we are to understand and amplify voices, we need to understand these issues far more deeply, and as educators, we need to kind of bring that to the forefront.